Michael Murphy, thank you so much for joining us. Let's talk about the consequences of DEI and, frankly, anti-white policies in British public life. I know that you've written a piece very recently describing the human tragedies that have happened because, basically, people have been discriminated against because of their race. Tell me more about that. Who has died as a result of this?
Yes, well, thank you for having me, Stephen. I wrote this piece about the human toll of anti-racism. It's counterintuitive subject because we tend to think that racism kills and that anti-racism is an unalloyed good. However, I think if you look at Britain and elsewhere, you'll see that it's actually this ideology which at its core it holds that any disparities between races, say in arrests for crimes or in one case detention for psychological problems, must be the result of racism, and therefore we need to enlist policemen, doctors, and the courts to act as amateur sociologists to try and sort of reverse engineer these disparities out of existence. And the most recent example is the case of a man who stabbed 3 people fatally in Nottingham in 2023 by the name of Valdo Calacane. Now, an inquiry at the time of filming is ongoing, and we're starting to learn a bit more about how this was allowed to happen. One potential fork in the road for this crime happened 3 years before the incident, where Calacane attempted to break into his neighbour's house, and when he was detained in medical custody, one of the doctors, we're told, had leaned towards having him sectioned. It was his first psychotic episode. He displayed violent antisocial behaviour. To most people, I think that would have seemed like a sound medical judgment. However, we've now learned that a team of medical professionals had considered studies which showed that black people in this country are disproportionately detained. We know the figure is around 4 times the national average. And therefore, they felt, this is apparently part of their reasoning, that they needed to avoid making that disparity worse. And so they once again unleashed him onto the public, where he continued to be violent. Actually, almost immediately after they released him, he attempted to break into a neighbor's house, and a woman had to jump out of a first floor window and sustained serious spinal injuries. And so you can draw a direct causal line between this ideology and the human harm that comes as a result of it. The public has in effect been enlisted into a social experiment which they never gave their consent to. And the grim ultimate reality was that 3 years later, after being sectioned 4 times, after a doctor in one report warning that he might go on to kill, tragically took the lives of 2 students, Barnaby Webber and Grace O'Malley Kumar, and a caretaker. And this is, we need to be honest about the fact that this ideology is killing people.
Okay, so there's an interesting comparison, isn't there, between anti-racism ideology and fear of being called racist.
Mm-hmm.
So in this case, the Nottingham killer, as you say, according to this inquiry, NHS officials basically said, we're concerned that we're sectioning too many black people, and therefore we'll let this guy go because he's black.
Well, it was less explicit than that, but they said that they, after one doctor had leaned towards sectioning him, then a team had considered this research. That's as strong as it goes, but we can draw our own inferences from that.
And then there's other cases, isn't there, where terrible things have happened, including terrorist attacks, because people were worried about intervening due to the fear of being called racist. So can you tell us about some of those cases?
Well, yeah. So there was a Taylor Swift concert in the Manchester Arena in 2017. And a man by the name of Salman Abedi, 22-year-old Libyan, walked into the stadium with a rucksack full of explosives. One of the security guards thought that he looked suspicious, but held off on going over and asking him any questions for fear of being seen as racist. And shortly after, he detonated a bomb that killed 22 people.
Children.
22 children.
Mostly.
Yeah. And one person for each year of life that this country gave him in Britain. So, had that security guard not had to worry about racism, or at least had put his primary duty, which is the safety of the venue, ahead of these other rather more abstract and tricky concerns, then that 22 lives might have been saved, and many more people who were injured might not have had to go through that trauma. So I think you can certainly draw a direct line between these these professionals on frontline services, whether it be security guards or police, having to worry about things that really should be the purview of politicians and sociologists, rather than people who are making life and death decisions in real time.
Another absolutely tragic, horrific event happened more recently in Southport, where children were brutally stabbed and murdered by this horrific monster. Again, there is an instance here where potentially, if authorities had intervened earlier, he would never have committed this terrible act. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Well, this is another case, Stephen, where all the warning signs were there. He had been found carrying a knife. He had been violent towards other people. His head teacher in his student profile had described him as sinister. And medical health workers at the school had scolded her, upbraided her for stereotyping a black boy with a knife. And you'd think that the last word in that sentence would be the giveaway that this is not just an ordinary black boy. In fact, it's rather insulting to law-abiding minorities that they are being used as a human shield for the worst, most depraved criminals in our society. And again, that's just one instance that we know of. I would imagine that there are many more forks in the road with Rudy Cabana where we may have been able to intervene and stop him. We know he was recommended to prevent Britain's terrorist prevention program, but they deemed that there wasn't enough evidence that he was an ideologically motivated terrorist or budding terrorist to intervene. And one has to wonder, given this pattern of reluctance of our authorities to intervene in what might be seen as racially sensitive cases, whether more opportunities like that were missed as a result of his skin color. If I was one of the, family member of one of those little girls, all under the age of 10, who were murdered brutally, sometimes stabbed dozens of times by this monster, I would want to know exactly, what was this ideology worth it?
So the Southport killings and the Manchester Arena bombing are not the only cases, again, where fear of being called racist potentially has caused a terrible outcome. Also the grooming gangs, this going back decades and decades. Tell us more about the grooming gangs.
Yeah, well, I think you're right to include that in this discussion, because it's probably the most extensive and egregious example of the authorities turning a blind eye to the worst, most depraved kinds of crimes against young English girls, often targeted because they are not Muslim and therefore seen as fair game by their abusers. This goes back probably more than 50 years. We still don't have all of the information. From one of the reports that we've seen, in Rotherham alone, 1,400 girls were abused, predominantly by Pakistani grooming gangs. And these people are often clans, so cousins, brothers, uncles, who know each other, and therefore had that high trust, as it were, to trust that if 10 of them were going to meet up and go and abuse a girl, they wouldn't let slip that this had happened. Now, the authorities for decades turned a blind eye for a number of reasons, but one factor that keeps coming up in report after report is that there was a fear of being seen as racist. Some of the family members of the groomers were actually in local government or in positions of prominence in their communities, and they were able to, on occasion, weaponize that fear to avoid people speaking about it. And, I've spoken to journalists who had a similar experience when they first tried to broach this topic.
So even editors at newspapers are worried about this perception of racism. And that, again, is just another layer, isn't it? The kind of fourth estate that's not... They let these girls down, basically.
Exactly. Everybody in our society must necessarily be scared of race, of being accused of being racist. This, goes back to the 70s, if not before. There was a case of a primary school teacher, I think, called Ray Honeyford in northern England, who made the reasonable observation that some of the Muslim girls in the school were not attending sort of swimming classes and weren't getting the full experience, and he was completely hounded out of his job, never to work again. And again, this is another sort of non-fatal, but nonetheless still horrific toll that this ideology has taken on us. I think it really became turbocharged in the 1990s with the Macpherson report after the murder of a black man by the name of Stephen Lawrence by sort of white thugs. This report, which was conducted by a retired judge, made 70 recommendations to rid Britain of the scourge of institutional racism, which is a poorly defined term, is at once ubiquitous, but also hard exactly to pin down what it is. And two of the most insidious recommendations in that was one urging the police to change their definition of a racist incident to something that has been perceived as racist either by a victim or anyone else. This is a hopelessly subjective definition, which obviously lends itself to excess. And then the other one was that it wasn't just the police that they were focused on, but all of the institutions of the state. So the judiciary, the NHS, etc. And they wanted to institute a complete sea change, armed in part with these sort of very broad definitions and in many cases powers to punish people for being seen as, for being accused of racism or perpetuating it. The problem as well is that the definition of racism or institutional racism doesn't necessarily need to involve being motivated by racial hatred. So as we said earlier, if there are disparities, say in how many black people are arrested relative to whites, ipso facto it must be a result of racism. And so we can get into the how sound that assumption is, but it essentially gives authorities a blank check to discipline and in some cases prosecute people for crimes that against minorities, real or imagined, that ultimately makes everybody take the precautionary principle. Because if you are a professional and you've worked hard in your career, you're not going to want to. That's not going to be the hill that you want to die on, to be accused of racism.
There's this phrase that has become popularized recently called suicidal empathy, and it seems that this suicidal empathy goes back decades in Britain. Particularly if we're talking about the grooming gangs and the cover-up over them. You could go back to the Second World War, and obviously after that you get the Windrush and immigrants coming into the country, and suddenly race relations becomes relevant, probably really for the first time in British history, because before that we were almost entirely a homogenous country. And then you get Enoch Powell in 1968 giving his speech, the Rivers of Blood speech, so called, And this seems to cause huge controversy, division in the media, that is. Actually, if you look at opinion polls at the time, he had a massive support from the public, 70% supported what he was saying.
Yes.
Can you talk a bit about where this fear of the public, of authorities, comes from, of being called racist? Where does this racism as the original sin come from? Is it kind of a recent phenomenon? Because some people would say, this is a BLM thing, this is a 2020 thing, or is this a post-war thing? Does Enoch impact it? Give us a bit of a history.
Yeah, well, I think, there's lots of moments and trends that you could point to. I certainly think that our experience in the Second World War, where, it really is a kind of it has become a morality tale about the danger of, racist majorities persecuting helpless minorities. And I think that's become a kind of, a quasi-religion, really, in the way that we constantly pore over it and have films about it and books that really are dedicated to that morality, and in part rightly so, because that is one of the lessons of the Second World War. I think as well that after we became a multi-ethnic, multicultural society, you might say, in a sort of fit of absence of mind, the authorities were playing catch up in trying to put out the fires that resulted from that. So we had riots in Notting Hill, we had various sort of high-profile racist incidents, Stephen Lawrence being one of them, and I think the authorities are terrified more than anything, and I think this is really what keeps the British state up at night, that anything that is inflammatory or seen as a a failure of multiculturalism, maybe minorities are misbehaving in a certain area in some sense, that will cause a backlash from the majority, and the state, I think, has long known that they would not be able to contain that if it were to spread, and so we've created a system which essentially almost like when you have two siblings, and a parent will, no matter if the younger sibling is the aggressor, the parent will still discipline the older sibling because they think they're bigger and stronger, and so I think that's the sort of paternalistic approach that they've taken, that minorities are to be protected at all times, even when they are certain factions or groups within those communities are doing things which are outrageous, and that the British public is to be restrained.
You talk about managing multiculturalism, essentially. Lots of different societies, empires have tried to do this previously. The billet system in the Austro-Hungarian, or the Ottoman Empire, sorry, and then you've got the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which sort of eventually splits up. And they've all got their own ways of trying to maintain and control and power and sort of divide and conquer and everything. Are we just seeing that again in modern Britain today? Is this just another example yet again of essentially an authority trying to manage different ethnic groups who have come together, who clearly have tensions and everything else that we've been seeing, let's say, in Leicester and other places?
Yeah. I mean, it's, there are a lot of echoes of that old Ottoman system in our current system. So, police during the Southport riots were talking about community leaders. So when they're speaking to the Muslim community in say, Southport or elsewhere, they will have these sort of self-elected officials who speak on behalf of the Muslims in that area. Now, that's completely inimical to the English sense of justice and individuality, which is to say that we have for hundreds of years treated our subjects as individuals.
And democracy. I mean, none of these community leaders, so-called, were elected. These weren't members of parliament or council, or maybe some of them were councillors, I don't know.
Precisely. So, it's eroded democratic norms, eroded ability to speak freely often, because if somebody, say, criticizes a community of Muslims, you'll have these self-elected elders or quangos who will come out and decry this and lobby the government to do something about it, which is why we now have various forms of blasphemy laws and hate speech being tabled regularly in the House of Commons in recent years. And so, the British state and the country of England in particular spent centuries breaking down clan structures. We did it in Wales, we did it in Scotland, we did it to some varying success in Ireland as well. What we've done since post-war is re-tribalized. And there's a kind of irony in this, in that out of a fear of national differences, we've reintroduced tribal differences as a way, as in the hope that it will all come out in the wash. There's a famous incident in the Balkan War in the 90s, where an American general called Wesley Clark said that the age of monocultural, monoethnic societies is over. We need multi-ethnic societies, and I think that this was conscious sort of American doctrine, and this did trickle down to us as well. America gets a cold, America sneezes, the world gets a cold, especially people who are under that umbrella, and we seem to have imported their model of race relations and their outlook on these things.
And what's so ironic is that someone like Enoch Powell was warning of exactly that.
Yeah.
He was terrified that Britain would become like America in having these terrible race relations, and how they treated black people in the riots and so on that they were experiencing in the 1950s and 1960s, and going beyond, obviously, the KKK and the Civil War in the 1860s. So it appears, and Powell made those predictions back in 68, that, we're going to see civil war, race wars, that kind of thing. Some people would say that's exaggerated. Some people would even argue that, particularly in terms of his predictions of numbers, he actually underestimated how many people were going to come to Britain and how diverse we really would become.
Yeah, of course. I mean, Powell was extremely prescient when he, was talking about figures. He, like you say, it was underestimated. Unfortunately, his language at the time was seen by, large parts of the establishment as incendiary. And I think that set the debate back quite a long time, because he became this boogeyman then, which, if you were to criticize immigration even modestly, they would say, well, you're a Powellite. And so certainly a kind of prophet on the demography question, but his more subjective interpretations, we could, they're debatable.
If multiculturalism as an ideology has a slogan, it is this: diversity is our strength.
Mm-hmm.
And that is something that the British political elites have been telling us for decades, including Rishi Sunak famously with a 50 pence coin that says diversity is our strength. I remember that image so strongly. I want to ask about, obviously, let's debate first. Is diversity a strength? And we'll move on to something else.
Well, I think you should, there's several answers to that question. The first, and that's, I think most appropriate at this time, is to say, was it a strength to the women who were murdered by Axel Rudy Cabana? Was it a strength to the thousands of girls who were molested, often in the most horrific fashion, by Pakistani grooming gangs? Was it a strength to those poor students in Nottingham and the older gentlemen who were murdered? I think that would be a slur on those people and their memories to assert that. And when I saw a judge who should have no business making value-based or normative sort of judgments about contested issues like that in court during his sentencing remarks, say that was my immediate thought. Diversity is often used to mean superficial differences, so different skin colors, different a sort of mosaic of different people, but monoculture in thought, absolutely no diversity in thought. So I think that diversity has been a cover for the most banal form of ideological conformity.
And it's also been a cover, has it not, of discriminating in practice against white people in Britain. Now, that some people may hear that and think I'm exaggerating or being hyperbolic or whatever, but there have been specific examples of this where this has been institutionalized. Look at the Royal Air Force, where 160 pilots were found to have been discriminated against because they were white. Look at the recent TfL, was it Ofcom? I forget, the regulator.
I think it was the advertising regulator.
Yeah, the regulator of TfL and the adverts. I want you to talk a bit about that and give us maybe some other examples of where, for diversity reasons, white people were basically left behind, whether it's in, admissions to Oxford and Cambridge or hiring in the civil service and so on.
Yeah, I mean, there's nothing wrong with diverse, a certain amount of diversity in terms of ethnicity or culture. That can be good, but it doesn't tell you very much that we care about. We should really be caring about diversity of thought, of character, and those things. I would say it's a sort of racist assumption, actually, to assume that those things map perfectly onto superficial, immutable characteristics. I think you're quite right to say that this has led to anti-white discrimination. In the examples you cited, there was a ruling by the advertising regulator the other day to say that the London Underground could not feature an advert of a black man sexually pestering a white woman because this conformed to racial stereotypes. The corollary of that is that we can only depict white men either harassing other white women or black women or whoever. Now, that creates a built-in racial prejudice against white people in the propaganda, this officially sanctioned propaganda of the country. The consequences of that are hard to, fully comprehend. But if you're a white person, that's not in your interest to have everybody seeing your group depicted as constantly as sex pests or menaces. There was another example of a campaign on the London Underground to try and stop people playing music out loud on their phones or listening to music or having conversations loudly. And it was a middle-aged white man, and everyone kind of mocked this as being as a clear example of, well, this isn't the usual suspect. In fact, anecdotally, in my experience, it's often foreign people, groups of young people, often with minorities or white people, and so we constantly get the sense that we're being propagandized by this, and I personally think people should resent it.
Michael Murphy, thank you so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much.